All rise. Welcome to day 7 of the evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Nell Tozer. There is no fire alarm testing today. If a fire alarm does go off, please follow the fire exits and make your way to the muster point located at the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On arrival, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and will be keeping a register of all attendees. The fire marshals will also be responsible for informing everyone of when it is safe to return to the hotel, in liaison with the representatives from Thistle Hotel. I now hand over to the Chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start today's proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. Now and for the last time this session, may I say what I usually say to those in the public gallery. You may use any handheld electronic device for the purpose of communicating silently what you have seen and heard in the hearing room, but only after 10 minutes have elapsed since the event that you are describing. You may not use your device for recording or photographing our proceedings. There is a formal note on the desk in front of you which sets out the terms of what I have summarised fully. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, sir. This morning I will in fact be reading out 3 summaries of evidence from managers who will not be giving oral evidence. They are HN 2152 Richard Scully, HN 350 Paul Croydon, and HN 308 Christopher Skay. I'll begin with the summary for Richard Scully. HN 2152 Richard Scully was a back office detective sergeant posted to the SDS from approximately late 1977 to mid-1979. He provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 29th of September 2020, which may be summarised as follows. Richard Scully joined the Metropolitan Police Service in 1964 and moved to Special Branch in 1968 as a constable. Prior to joining the SDS, he served on B and C squads. He cannot recall the exact dates of his time with the SDS, but the inquiry believes he joined the unit in late 1977. Richard Scully had not done any undercover policing prior to joining the SDS, though he did attend demonstrations and meetings while in Special Branch. He did not know what the SDS did prior to his joining, and he was not provided with any training. He states that joining the SDS was not a question of choice. He did as he was told. Scully fulfilled an administrative role and describes himself as the, quote, processing point for undercover officers reporting. He recalls intelligence coming into the office typed and on scraps of paper to be written up. He would check names and reports for any associated Special Branch file numbers and add them where needed. He states that he would alter the report where necessary, for example, to fix typos or factual inaccuracies, or to correct the English. Information might also be rearranged into a different order. He would not have been provided with things like photographs from the SDS officers. Those would rather come from the branch photographic unit and could be shown to an officer to confirm the identity of a particular person. To his knowledge, individual sources would not be identified, which was in line with ordinary Special Branch practice. However, the information number would be qualified with an S to indicate S Squad. Scully states that he did not filter the information. His job was to present the factual position, and it was for someone else to interpret its significance. Reports would be typed, then forwarded on where required or put into files. He notes it would not be for him to determine which reports were forwarded. Reports would be sent from S Squad to the operational squads in the branch, and it would be the chief superintendent of those recipient squads who would determine what action, if any, should be taken. Scully does not believe that he signed or marked up any reports, but rather it would be signed by the superintendent or chief inspector before it left the office. He did not have any involvement with the report after its onwards transmission. Richard Scully was aware that reports would also be forwarded to the security service. However, that decision would be made by a more senior officer than himself. He describes the security service as, quote, the main beneficiary of SDS reporting, and confirms that a lot of the information requests received by the SDS came from the security service. Elsewhere in his statement, he states that the security service were the great beneficiaries of the undercover approach other than the uniform branch. He notes that the SDS did get thanks from the security service for particular reports. Scully states that he had no direct involvement with the security service while in the SDS. Scully describes the filing system in place for Special Branch and notes that files would be made for individuals and for organizations. The file number would reflect what politics were an issue. He believes that files had review dates on them, and they would be sent to governors for regular assessment to decide what to do with them. Richard Scully states that he had no involvement in directing or targeting UCOs, but he believes that would be down to the superintendent. He was likewise not involved in the procurement or administration of safe houses, cover accommodation or vehicles, cover documents, or overtime claims. He was not involved in drafting the annual reports. Richard Scully operated from Scotland Yard, but recalls attending regular safe house meetings. He mentions that it was considered important for the UCOs to meet up and, quote, let off steam. He says, quote, often there would also be a meal, and they would tell us what they thought of us. He believes there may have been discussions about deployments at these meetings, but they would have not been addressed to him. Overall, Scully states that he personally had little interaction with the undercover officers. He knows that there would have been one-on-one meetings available between management and the UCOs if needed. He notes, quote, the supervising guys were very, very conscious of emotional well-being and all the problems that the undercover officers were exposed to. This was front and center of what the supervisors were doing. Scully was not aware of any unhappy working relationships between members of the SDS. To his knowledge, none of his contemporaries provoked or encouraged a third party to commit a criminal offence, engaged in sexual activity whilst in their cover identity, were arrested, tried, or convicted in their cover identity, were involved in incidents of public disorder or violence, or reported on any legally privileged information. He cannot say whether any of his contemporaries reported on the activities of elected politicians. He believes it was branch policy not to report on politicians. Richard Scully states that he was unaware of any training for new undercover officers, but notes that they had, quote, quite a lot of lead-up time before going into the field. He states that UCOs, quote, were carefully assessed to see if they were suitable for the role and then had considerable reading in time before going into the field. They knew what they were up against and could leave at that point if they wanted. It was very carefully thought out. Richard Scully remembers David McNee visiting the SDS when he was a new commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, stating, quote, I think it was assumed he should see the SDS because it was so sensitive that it could cause him grief. He remembers Jeffrey Kraft guiding him through the squad's operations in the SDS office and McNee questioning everyone on their role. Scully believes McNee also visited the undercover officers in the SDS flat, though he was not personally present at that visit. Exceptionally, Richard Scully ran an informant alongside his work in the SDS. He explains that he had started with this informant while posted to C Squad, while dealing with anarchist matters, and ended up maintaining the contact throughout his time in the SDS. He states that it was quite difficult to keep it up as it took a lot of extra time, and the area of interest covered by the informant did not coincide with his SDS work. His experience with the informant did give him prior understanding of how special branch squads provided aid to uniform branch with forecasts for public events. Scully reflects in his witness statement on the benefits of undercover policing as compared to relying on informants. He states that while informants were, quote, generally fine, the only way to find out exactly what was being planned was with undercover policing. He also notes that in matters where urgent reporting was required, quote, the odd informant was not enough. Undercover policing allowed efforts to be concentrated where needed. He does note, however, that he, quote, was a bit surprised we were allowed to do this with undercover policing, but we had official backing. Richard Scully reported directly to DCI Mike Ferguson while in the SDS, but notes that he ultimately did not have much to do with Ferguson as he operated out in the field. Scully states that he and Ferguson, quote, did not click, and he felt that Ferguson interfered in the running of his informant. This led to tensions that later escalated over an unfavorable annual report. Scully states, quote, I remember I had a very poor annual report from Mike Ferguson because of my personal problems with him, such that it was very unfair, and I did have a word with Derek Neal out of desperation to explain the work I was doing. He asked for evidence, and I put in a quantity of information. I think I overheard him taking Mike Ferguson to task over this, even though I was not asking for that. Scully states that he enjoyed his work on the SDS, but that the incident with DCI Ferguson, quote, tipped him into leaving the squad. The inquiry believes he left the SDS in mid-1979. When asked what he believes the SDS achieved for the benefit of policing, Richard Scully says that, quote, undercover officers identified real troublemakers, people who were potentially dangerous to the state, to put it in a grand way, and who were promoting violent and dangerous behavior in the streets to the danger of ordinary citizens. We were able to contain the worst aspects of what could affect the public and protect them. After his time on the SDS, Scully was posted to ports, as he says he wished to get out of the general atmosphere of Special Branch. He returned for a time to B Squad after this on the invitation of Ray Wilson, and later ended up in another posting on S Squad, unrelated to the SDS. He states that he did not have any involvement with SDS intelligence after his departure from the unit. Richard Scully retired from the Metropolitan Police Service in 1994. So I'll now move on to the summary of the statement of HN 350, Paul Croydon. Detective Sergeant Paul Croydon was posted to the SDS from the 30th of July 1979 to August 1981. He provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 20th of October 2020. It may be summarized as follows. Paul Croydon joined the Metropolitan Police Service in 1966 and moved to Special Branch in late 1969. Among his Special Branch postings prior to joining the SDS, he served two stints on Special Branch C Squad dealing with general inquiries. Paul Croydon first became aware of the SDS from HN 45, cover name David Robertson, who had been deployed as an undercover officer and who he knew socially. Croydon recalls being told that the squad was referred to as the Harries and that they did undercover work, but nothing more. Paul Croydon was approached in the late 1970s by DI Angus McIntosh, who inquired whether he would be interested in joining the SDS. McIntosh had been Croydon's sergeant in naturalization, and Croydon describes it as having been a, quote, good working relationship. They also knew each other socially. Croydon states that he was not informed of the purpose of the unit prior to joining, but was told that the role was administrative and primarily involved collating and arranging reporting. He accepted the position and began with the SDS in July 1979. Paul Croydon recalls on his first day meeting DI McIntosh and DCI Ferguson, who explained the purpose and history of the unit. There was no formal training, but there was a handover period of 3 to 4 weeks with DS Dick Scully, whom Croydon replaced in the back office. He does not recall being shown any training materials and says that he trained on the job. He remembers that the SDS office was initially based in New Scotland Yard when he joined, but moved to a secure unit in Vincent Square several months into his posting. Paul Croydon states that his primary role in the SDS was to process reports from the undercover officers. He would be given handwritten reports following the regular meetings in the safe house, and it would be his responsibility to read each report and make corrections if needed. The corrections would be stylistic, such as fixing spelling and grammatical mistakes. Information would only be removed from a report if it was repetitive. He notes that there was a high standard of reporting in Special Branch, and officers could have their reports heavily modified, quote, almost to the point of pedantry. Croydon cannot recall ever amalgamating reports from more than one officer, though notes that the UCOs may have liaised with each other to produce a joint report if more than one had attended a large event. In addition to stylistic changes, Paul Croydon would add Special Branch and Security Service file reference numbers to the reports. This was done by telephoning Special Branch records to determine which individuals had open files, mentions, or no trace. He states that he had no direct contact or dealing with the Security Service during his time on the SDS. Croydon notes the use of a technique learned from DS Scully to occasionally include the cover name of a UCO within the reports. He explains that the reason was to obscure the UCO's identity to the Security Service in case they also had an informant in the group. Once all amendments were complete, a modified report would be handed to an office typist to produce in duplicate before being passed to the DCI. The DCI would be responsible for disseminating the intelligence to the relevant section of Special Branch. Paul Croydon recalls that the superintendents on S Squad, David Palmer Hall and Kenneth Pride at the time, took receipt of the reports. If the report concerned public order, a copy would also be sent to the A8 Uniform Division via Special Branch liaison. One copy of the report would be sent to Scotland Yard and the second stored in a secure room in the SDS offices at Vincent Square. Paul Croydon confirms that most SDS intelligence was written down either as a report or put into a report after a phone call. Urgent calls would also have been passed on to the relevant squad by telephone. He suspects that a large proportion of public order matters were passed on orally in this way. Croydon notes that the Special Branch surveillance and photographic units shared offices with the SDS in Vincent Square. He recalls that an album of photographs would sometimes be taken to safe house meetings following a demonstration to allow the UCOs to identify relevant individuals. Those photos might then be appended to a report. Paul Croydon states that he did not play any part in tasking, procurement of cover documents, procurement or administration of accommodation or vehicles, processing overtime claims, or drafting of annual reports. Croydon states that he did occasionally receive the daily welfare calls from the deployed officers. They would be required to ring the office by 11 a.m. He confirms that this was equally an opportunity to pick up on any new information or get clarification on a particular report if needed. Paul Croydon states that the majority of his interaction with the UCOs was by telephone, as he would only occasionally visit the safe houses. He would sometimes play sports or have lunch with the UCOs, but usually the purpose of his attendance at the safe houses would be to clear up ambiguous text in a report or conduct a welfare visit. The DCI and DI would be the ones to attend the safe house meetings regularly. He was not aware of any unhappy working relationships between members of the SDS. Paul Croydon served with DCI's Ferguson and Moss and DI's McIntosh, HN 68, and Butler. Croydon suggests that there was a high level of supervision and control by the DCI and DIs over the undercover officers and the administrative staff. He notes that he was always supervised by them and confirms that they were responsible for tasking the undercover officers. He also suggests that UCOs received feedback on their reporting from the DCI and DIs at meetings in the safe houses. Croydon states that he himself did not give any feedback, aside from asking certain officers to improve their handwriting. Paul Croydon travelled over a weekend on 2 occasions to provide cover for UCOs attending demonstrations outside of London. He spent 2 days in Scotland for a protest against the Torness nuclear power station attended by HN 155, cover name Phil Cooper, and travelled to Liverpool to assist officers in the 1981 SWP Right to Work March. Both times he was accompanied by DI Trevor Butler. Croydon recalls that they took an office car and kept in contact with the UCOs through the use of pagers. Paul Croydon recalls undercover officers spending time in the back office prior to their deployments. He states that it would be between 3 to 6 months, where their primary role would be creating their legends. They would also assist with administrative tasks in the office. No UCOs spent time in the back office following their withdrawal. To his knowledge, none of his contemporaries provoked or encouraged a third party to commit a criminal offence, engaged in sexual activity whilst in their cover identity, were arrested, tried, or convicted in their cover identity, were involved in incidents of public disorder or violence, or reported on any legally privileged information or elected politicians. He states that he believes his contemporaries achieved a great deal for policing, gathering intelligence which was instrumental for the effective and proper policing of demonstrations. He also believes that the SDS was of assistance to the security service, stating, quote, "I do not think that it would be possible for the security service to obtain the same depth and quality of intelligence by using any other method." Paul Croydon left the SDS in August 1981. He states that he was asked to stay by DCI Butler, but he felt he did not want to be tied to a predominantly administrative job. He was succeeded in his role by HN 45. After leaving the SDS, Croydon undertook positions including on C Squad and later B Squad. He cannot recall coming across intelligence emanating from the SDS in these roles, though accepts that it is feasible that he did. Paul Croydon retired from the MPS in 1989 at the rank of Detective Sergeant. He concludes his statement with the following comment, quote, "I have no more evidence to give other than to say that during my time with the SDS, it was a highly professional unit that acted in a proficient, skilled, and upstanding manner. Sadly, the unit has subsequently been besmirched by the poor behavior of a few officers." End quote. Finally, sir, I have the summary for HN 308, Christopher Skay. Christopher Skay served on the SDS as an administrative detective sergeant from approximately mid-1978 to early 1982. He has provided 2 witness statements to the inquiry, the first dated the 15th of December 2020, and the second dated the 8th of December 2021. They may be summarized as follows. Christopher Skay joined the Metropolitan Police Service as a cadet in 1958, becoming a full constable in 1960. He recalls being on duty as a uniformed officer during the 1968 Grosvenor Square demonstration and witnessing what he describes as, quote, large-scale disorder. He ended up applying to join Special Branch that year. Skay worked for various squads, including that which dealt with Irish extremism, where he was promoted to Detective Sergeant. Christopher Skay is unable to recall the exact dates of his posting in the SDS, but the inquiry believes that he joined around mid-1978. He recalls that he may have been asked to join by DI Angus McIntosh. He states that he did not receive any formal training for the job, but recalls speaking to DS Dick Walker, who had filled the role before him, as a form of handover. Skay recalls first becoming aware of the SDS around a year before he joined. However, he notes that the need-to-know culture of Special Branch meant that it was not something readily discussed. Christopher Skay describes his position as a purely administrative back-office role. He lists his primary responsibilities as the processing of expense claims and liaising with the Transport Department over the procurement and disposal of suitable vehicles for the undercover officers. He assisted in procuring a car for the SDS office and would liaise with officers and the MPS Transport Department to ensure that UCO cars were inspected and met police standards. He did not have a role in registering the vehicles in the cover names of the undercover officers and understood that this was something they did themselves. Skay did help compile transport cost and expenditure for the unit and is identifiable in the 1980 and 1981 SDS annual reports signing off the transport expenses. Christopher Skay was also involved in sourcing and looking after the SDS safe houses, one of which was replaced during his time in the role. He was not involved in the procurement of cover accommodation for the officers, as this was done by the UCOs themselves. Skay states that he was involved in a limited way with the welfare of the UCOs. He states that his role during the regular safe house meetings would be to check if the UCOs needed anything. He would also collect receipts for officers' expense claims and pay out the previous week's expenses. Skay does not recall seeing any welfare issues at the time and believes officers would have known to let management know if there were problems. Indeed, he recalls morale being generally high and agrees with similar comments made in the 1980 SDS annual report. Christopher Skay states that he was unaware of any UCOs committing a criminal offense or acting as an agent provocateur, engaging in sexual activity while in their cover identity, being arrested or convicted in their cover identity, being involved in public disorder or criminal activity, reporting legally privileged information, or reporting on elected politicians or trade unions. When asked by the inquiry about specific officers, Skay asserts that he was unaware of any concerns regarding HN 155, cover name Phil Cooper's performance, any potential compromises relating to HN 126, cover name Paul Gray, or the incident that arose with HN 80, cover name Colin Clark, that required his family to relocate. He likewise was unaware of any suggestion that HN 106, Barry Tompkins, or HN 21 had sexual activity in their undercover identity. He states that if he did know of any sexual activity, he would have told more senior officers as there was a risk of compromise and it would have been in breach of the police regulations. Skay states that he did not know that HN 21 developed significant medical issues as a result of his time in the SDS, and says that if he had known, he would have encouraged him to speak to more senior officers and seek medical assistance. Skay was not aware of an allegation that HN 67, cover name Alan Bond, had fathered a child in his undercover identity, but notes that this officer was not deployed when Skay was in the SDS. Christopher Skay states that he was aware that the majority of officers deployed when he was part of the SDS adopted the identities of deceased children. He notes, quote, "As far as I am aware, this practice was in place when I joined. I did not at any stage question it or ask who it was who had begun this practice." He confirms that he had no role in authorizing the use of deceased children's identities. Quote, "With hindsight, I can see that it may be distressing for surviving relatives if told, but then the expectation was that they would not be told. At the time, I must admit that I didn't give much thought to this." Christopher Skay confirms that thought was given by management to protect officers whose deployments required them to travel outside of London. If an undercover officer was required to travel outside of the MPS district for an event where there was a risk of arrest or to their safety, back office staff would liaise with the local police force at their destination. Skay states that, quote, often 2 of the SDS back office staff would go to that area to liaise with the constabulary concerned to ensure that if the UCO happened to be arrested, we would be able to deal with the local police immediately. Skay himself recalls going to Edinburgh twice in relation to events concerned with the Torness Power Station, and Liverpool once. He confirms that no incidents arose on these trips that required intervention. Christopher Skay would also assist the other administrative staff in the back office, including DS Richard Scully and DS Paul Croydon, in processing intelligence reports, though this was not his primary responsibility. He recalls receiving intelligence from UCOs at the twice-weekly Safe House meetings and by phone, though he does not recall how much would have been passed on orally. To his memory, all information that came into the SDS would end up being written down. He recalls that the notes would be tidied up without changing their meaning before being sent to the typing pool. Christopher Skay states that he would have taken calls while in the SDS office, providing intelligence updates or conveying information too urgent to write down. He recalls having to contact the duty inspector of Special Branch occasionally to pass on urgent intelligence. Skay states that he played no part in tasking, instructing, or steering UCOs to collect any particular intelligence. He likewise did not decide where intelligence was to be disseminated. He confirms that decisions on ultimate dissemination were done by the customer of the information, for example, Special Branch, the Home Office, A8, or the Security Service. Skay states that he did not have any direct contact with the Security Service, but recalls that they would ask for information on certain groups or persons. He believes that they would have been in touch with officers of superintendent rank or above. It was his impression that the Security Service had a good working relationship with Special Branch. He confirms that intelligence reports would have been held in Special Branch records. He did not believe that the SDS had its own records room. When asked about gathering of personal information by undercover officers, Skay states that, quote, it was gathered because it ensured that in the future, should there be any problems with the groups, then the authorities would be aware of the identities and associations of persons involved. If demonstrations fragmented, this could cause real issues, and knowing who was associated with the broader groups was important. It also meant that people would be able to be identified accurately. Government and police departments had a vetting process for which association with certain groups may have been an important consideration. He notes that the SDS was, quote, a conduit for information. In terms of senior oversight, Christopher Skay states that he believes the Deputy Assistant Commissioner came to visit the SDS once or twice a year, and specifically recalls Colin Hewitt visiting once. He also remembers the Assistant Commissioner Gilbert Kelland visiting once. He does not believe that any external regulatory body visited the SDS during his time there. After leaving the SDS, Skay served for several months as the Special Branch Liaison Officer with the A8 Uniformed Public Order Unit. His role was to get information from Special Branch and to report orally to A8 on potentially problematic public order events. He believes that the majority of this intelligence must have come from the SDS. He notes that the liaison officer was not the only means of communicating between branches. He states, quote, there were other communications and decisions taking place at other levels and on other channels, and my role was to assist at a more administrative, day-to-day level. I would put questions and requests to Special Branch on behalf of A8 and pass back the responses I would receive, and I would receive information from Special Branch unprompted and feed this to A8. Christopher Skay confirms that he did have some direct contact with the SDS in this post. He states that A8 would not have made requests directly of the SDS, considering the covert nature of the squad. Rather, requests were made generally of Special Branch, but as liaison officer, he would have known when a particular answer needed to be sought from the S Squad or from the SDS. He does recall sanitizing information received from Special Branch to protect its source. He also remembers pulling different pieces of information together into a single document for use by A8, though he notes that this is a feature of Special Branch work more generally and accepts he might be thinking of work he did in another post. After leaving this position, Skay served in the anti-terrorism branch and then the unit concerned with the extreme left wing until his retirement. Christopher Skay served in the MPS for 30 years before retiring at the rank of Detective Inspector in 1990. Sir, that concludes the summaries. The documents related to all of these managers will be published on the inquiry website today, along with documents for two further deceased managers. They are HN 608 Kenneth Pride, who was Detective Chief Inspector in charge of the SDS between November 1977 to early 1978, and HN 135 Michael Ferguson, who was head of the SDS between January 1978 and February 1980. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We will break for 10 minutes to enable the hearing room to be set up for our last and only witness today, Trevor Butler.
All rise, please.
Mr. Butler, I understand you wish to affirm.
Thank you, sir, yes.
Yes, and the words will be read out to you by Mr. Fernandez.
Thank you. Please repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Butler.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Butler, could you start, please, with your full name?
Trevor Charles Butler.
You've provided us with a witness statement dated the 21st of January 2021, signed on the 17th of March 2021. Are the contents of that witness statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Could I start, please, with a little bit about your training? You tell us you were trained at Peel House, Hendon, and had a CID course in 1969 and went to Bramshill in 1978. Is that right?
That's right.
And would you, in the course of at least some of that training, have been trained on police powers of entry, search and seizure?
I can't recall, but it would be logical that I would have done, yes.
And did you understand that a police officer doesn't have an automatic right of entry to private premises?
Yes.
And did you understand that a police officer doesn't have an automatic right to confidential information?
On consideration, yes.
You qualified your answer with "on consideration." What was your understanding at the time?
I'd never given it any thought, to be honest.
Were you given any training about how these basic legal principles applied to the work of undercover police officers?
No.
Did you give that any thought?
No.
Did you consider that they applied to your work as the manager of an undercover police unit?
Could you refresh me? What are we talking about now?
About a police officer's powers of entry and seizure of confidential information.
No, I can't say that I gave that any consideration.
I appreciate this next question is something of a long shot, Mr. Butler. Did anyone train you on the European Convention of Human Rights in the 1960s and 1970s?
No.
You've already told us in your witness statement that you didn't have any training on the Discrimination Acts. Did you give any consideration to discrimination whilst you were serving in the SDS?
No.
You were presumably trained about the police discipline regulations.
Yes.
And for example, that sexual misconduct was an offence contrary to police discipline.
Yes.
Was that something that you thought applied to the work of undercover police officers?
No.
Why not?
Because the officers I worked with on the SDS were experienced, trustworthy men who I had no concerns about.
I think that's slightly different to the question I was asking. Did you think that if they did commit an act of sexual misconduct whilst on duty undercover, they were subject to police disciplinary regulations or not?
Yes, of course.
Were you familiar with the Peelian principles, Sir Robert Peel's principles of policing? Shall I try, from the look you're giving me?
If you remind me, sir.
Shall I try you with a couple? The first is, were you familiar with the principle that the ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent upon public approval of police actions.
Of course.
Did you give any consideration to whether or not the public would approve of what the SDS was doing?
With hindsight, I would have thought the public would have been hugely grateful for the work that the undercover officers did.
And without going into any details, because
the officers were there to help protect the tranquility and safety of the public.
the next principle I want to put to you is police must secure the willing cooperation of the public in voluntary observance of the law to be able to secure and maintain the respect of the public.
Yes.
Did you give maintaining the respect of the public any consideration in relation to the way in which the SDS was operating?
I didn't give it particular consideration, but overall, it was the standard by which we served in the Metropolitan Police, that we are a force that policed by consent, which is a shorthand form of the pure objectives.
And were you familiar with the principle that a police officer is essentially a member of the public devoting his or her full working time to upholding law and order?
Certainly.
And that unless a statute provided so, you have no special legal rights or powers?
Only those granted to a constable.
Can I ask you now a little bit about the training you got when you joined Special Branch? I realise that you joined Special Branch a long time before 1979, but the only syllabus that we have been able to find for Special Branch training is dated 1979. So what I'm going to do is have some of it called up for you to look at, and then the question I'm going to ask you is whether that was broadly similar to the training that you had. So if we could have up, please, UCPI 5034702. And if we could go to the next page, please. You see, in the first week, there was a lot of training on the role of Special Branch structure, the role of the security service, the police security service liaison, and an introduction to the threat of subversion and the role of the desk officer. I am paraphrasing. Were those the sorts of things that you were trained on?
As far as I can recall, there was no formal training similar to that which is being displayed. It was very much learning on the job.
I see. Well, if I that may cut short the need to go through the rest of the document, but can I ask you this then? Where did you get your understanding of what subversion was from?
I can't say that I ever did gain that understanding, other than from my own experience and common sense. I don't think I was ever trained as to exactly what subversion is or was.
Was there a received understanding, a received wisdom within Special Branch about which groups were subversive and which groups were not subversive?
I believe so.
And was there any influence from the security service about what was and what was not subversive?
Not at a junior level, no.
Can I move, we can take that document down now. Can I move to C Squad? You spent 10 months on C Squad in around September 1971, and then some more time as a detective inspector on C Squad between approximately July 1978 and September 1979. Is that right?
Yes.
When you were working for C Squad, what roles did you have on C Squad?
When I first joined C Squad, it would have been dealing with inquiries which were issued to officers, occasionally attending meetings, and doing general special branch work.
Did you do any work on the industrial desk at any point?
I did not.
Did you ever prepare threat assessments for A8?
I did not.
Did you do any work which involved you using any intelligence that had come from the SDS?
Not that I was aware of, no.
Did you make any requests for intelligence from the SDS?
No.
What was your level of awareness of the existence of the SDS before you joined the unit?
Quite slight. I knew of its existence, but very little more than that.
In 1971, when you were working for C Squad running into 72, is it right that the main concerns from a public order point of view were those that followed from the imposition of internment and from events on Bloody Sunday?
I can't recall.
Moving to when you were in C Squad in early 1979, can you recall the demonstration at which Blair Peach was fatally injured?
No, I can't.
Can you recall whether there was any interest expressed within C Squad or asked of C Squad relating to the Friends of Blair Peach campaign?
No, I can't recall that.
You spent some time on B Squad in the mid-1970s between, we think, June 1975 and June 1977. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was in the aftermath of the terrorist outrages at Birmingham and Guildford, wasn't it?
Yes.
How significant were Irish-related matters to Special Branch at this time?
I believe at that time Special Branch still had the main responsibility for tackling Republican terrorism before the security service took that role, and so it would have been quite significant.
Can you answer the next questions with a yes or a no, please? Did you knowingly work with any intelligence which emanated from the SDS?
No.
Are you able to, this you don't have to answer with a yes or no, are you able to help us with whether or not the infiltration by the SDS of the Troops Out movement was of any assistance to B Squad?
My knowledge of the activities of the SDS at that stage were almost non-existent, so I wouldn't have been aware of their dealings with the Troops Out movement.
Right. I'm going to move now to your time in the SDS. We understand from your witness statement that you joined around September 1979.
Yes, sir.
And that you took command when Barry Moss was promoted.
Yes.
We think that Barry Moss was promoted on or around the 5th of January 1981. Does that sound about the time you took over command?
Probably, I can't remember.
You held that role in an acting rank until you were substantively promoted in July 1981, is that right?
Yes.
And then you were replaced by Detective Chief Inspector Short in around January 1982.
Yes.
Can I ask you first about your arrival at the unit? Did you receive a handover?
I don't remember exactly, but I'm fairly certain that I spent a certain amount of time with Angus McIntosh.
And would your time with Angus McIntosh have been sufficient to cover who the undercover officers were who were serving with the unit at that time?
Yes.
Did it cover what was expected of you in terms of your duties?
Yes.
Were you told anything of past problems with an officer being presented with his death certificate?
No.
At that stage or at any other time?
No.
Did Mr. McIntosh, when you joined the unit, tell you anything about one of the officers marrying an activist?
No.
Did you hear any rumours that an officer's cover had been compromised because he got involved with members of the opposite sex?
No.
Were you given any briefing about the legality of what the SDS did?
No.
Were you given any guidance about the SDS's ethics?
No.
Were you told in broad terms what intelligence was being gathered, why and for whom?
In broad terms, yes.
And in broad terms, what was the answer?
That their primary purpose was to obtain intelligence concerning forthcoming demonstrations. This would be passed to the office at Scotland Yard and disseminated to A8 and others who needed the information.
Did the handover cover the relationship between the SDS and the security service?
Not that I recall.
Did it cover the relationship with C Squad in any more detail than you've just mentioned?
No.
B Squad?
No.
Was it explained to you that the undercover police officers used deceased children's identities, in part at least, to found their cover identities?
Not at that stage, no.
Did it cover target selection?
Target selection, as far as I was aware at that stage, was very much to try to offer complete coverage and was usually done on a geographic basis.
Is that because at the time there were a lot of people infiltrating the Socialist Workers' Party in different parts of London?
That was the main reason, yes.
Were you given any instruction or guidance to review existing deployments?
No.
The 1979 annual report contains a passage which says that covert policing was being subjected to increasingly close and critical scrutiny. Can you recall what that increasingly close and critical scrutiny was?
No, I can't.
At around the time you joined the SDS and were serving in it, the inquiry has seen documents which show that the Home Office was expressing some concerns about the relationship between Special Branch and the Security Service. Were you aware of any such concerns?
No, I wasn't.
Were you aware of any debate about the role of Special Branch vis-à-vis the Security Service?
No.
Can I move now to how undercover officers were recruited into the SDS? It's right, isn't it, that almost all of the undercover officers were married, weren't they?
They were.
And was one advantage of selecting officers who were married that it reduced the risk of them becoming involved sexually with activists or
Yes.
other members of the public? And another reason was it helped to anchor them in reality when they weren't operating undercover.
I believe so.
Can you recall whether you recruited the officer we know as HN 155?
No.
Can I move now to the question of cover identities? Could you answer this question, yes or no? Were you aware of any previous compromise of an SDS undercover police officer?
No.
Can you help us with whether officers identified a suitable deceased child alone or with assistance?
I believe it was alone.
Were they given any guidance about how to do it?
Not by me.
Where would they have got instruction as to what to do?
A recruit to the SDS would spend some time, possibly months, in the back office preparing himself for eventual work undercover. He would talk to staff there. He would also meet serving undercover officers and speak to them. And that was where he would gain this information.
Did you take any steps to check or test how robust cover identities were before your officers deployed?
I didn't know.
Do you know whether anybody else did?
Not to my knowledge.
I'm going to quote from the 1980 SDS annual report, which includes the passage, "Supervisory staff place great emphasis on the need to ensure that an officer's cover is as secure as possible before he enters the field." How was that great emphasis placed if you didn't check their cover identities before they deployed?
I repeat that I didn't check them. I can't recall whether other members of the office did. Or perhaps they were checked by using one of the undercover officers or somebody who had previously served as an undercover officer.
Is it right that great emphasis was placed on ensuring that the cover identity was as secure as possible?
Well, in light of my answer just now, I can't agree that that was the case.
Did you have a view as to how important using a deceased child's identity was?
When I became aware of the fact that this system was in operation, I thought that it was acceptable and an efficient way of establishing the new identity.
Did you think it was important?
If there was no other way to achieve that end, then it was important.
Did you consider whether there was another way?
No.
I'm getting the impression you simply picked up the existing practice and ran with it. Is that fair?
It is fair, but at that time I wasn't critical of the process.
Do you know whether or not the Regional Crime Squad used this method?
I've no idea.
Did you give any consideration to the utility of using the tactic? By which I mean what additional protection it brought?
No, it was an accepted practice which seemed to work well, and I, at the time, found no fault with.
Did you consider the risks that a family might find out that a police officer was using the name of their deceased child?
At that time, no, I didn't consider that.
Looking back now, do you think it was a necessary practice?
I think it probably was a necessary practice. I didn't realise at the time that families of the deceased children would learn of the system and be distressed by it.
And why do you think it was necessary?
I didn't have any alternative suggestions for obtaining their identity, their birth certificate, passport, whatever.
Do you think now that it was an appropriate tactic to use?
I do.
Notwithstanding the distress of some of the families who found out?
That is now with hindsight. At the time, I thought it was the correct process.
I'm asking you now about your position, your reflections.
Well, my reflection now is that a lot could have been improved to provide their identity cover. I think they were put in a very difficult position to establish that cover, and they should have had far greater support from the Home Office and senior police officers to make the whole process more secure and easier for them to adopt.
We've had some evidence from the very, very early days of the SDS of 2 officers being issued with British visitors' passports in the days before deceased children's identities were used. Was it really necessary to use this practice?
I wasn't aware of the BVPs, and if somebody had suggested an alternative system, then I perhaps would have agreed and implemented it, but nothing was suggested, and as I was saying, it worked well at the time.
On the subject of the training of undercover police officers, was there a black folder in the office containing advice and guidance for undercover officers?
I wasn't aware of it. aware since, but I never saw it and wasn't aware at the time.
Well, we've had, to be fair to you, Mr. Butler, mixed evidence about whether there was such a folder. Do you have any independent recollection as to whether or not there was such a folder?
I don't know.
Targeting. In other words, which groups or which geographical areas officers were allocated to. Can I start at a high level? There were some places that SDS officers seem simply not to have gone. One example of that is the Irish Republican Army. I understand from your witness statement that there was never any question of the SDS deploying into the IRA. Is that right?
That's right.
And was that a decision that you had to take, or one that had already been taken?
One that had been taken.
Are you able to help us with who had taken that decision and when?
No, I imagine it had been taken some time beforehand, because there was no talk of any officers having been involved recently in Irish matters.
We also know that in this era, no SDS officers were deliberately infiltrated into the far right. Did you give any consideration to any officers who joined whilst you were managing the SDS deploying into the far right?
No.
Why was that?
That consideration would have been made by officers senior to me. They would have indicated to me that was what was being considered and asked for me to implement the action. I certainly didn't give it any consideration.
I'm getting the sense that you might have had an understanding that this was just a field into which the SDS did not go at that time.
Correct.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
And where had you got that understanding from?
From day-to-day practice, that matters of the far right were very rarely even discussed, other than in terms of the confrontation between the left and the right.
Since, as we've heard, confrontations between the left and the right were a significant source of public disorder in the time that we're talking about, why was it, are you able to help as to why it was that only the far left was infiltrated by the SDS?
I can't help you, I'm afraid.
There were some officers who seemed to have been given a very considerable discretion as to which groups to target and simply given a geographical area into which to go. Is that right?
Yes.
And there were other officers who seemed to have been given some clear guidance to go into a specific field. I'm thinking here, for example, of HN 65. Who infiltrated the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Can you assist us as to how the decision to direct HN 65 to do that came about?
No, I can't recall. I believe that officer joined at about the time I was leaving. It may even have been that his his target was asked of him after I'd left? I don't recall.
It was a time at which CND was getting bigger and there were more demonstrations than there'd been for some time in that field, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you recall whether there was any sense within Special Branch that this was an area of growing significance to Special Branch?
If I recall, the concern was that extremist groups on the left would infiltrate and use the CND rather than the problem arising from core members of the CND.
Can you recall whether there was any interest emanating from the Home Office about
I don't recall.
CND?
I'm sorry.
Can you recall whether there was any interest emanating from any other part of government?
No, I can't.
We were, of course, still in the midst of the Cold War in those days, and you've mentioned in your witness statement the impact and influence that had. Would it be fair to say that the concerns about the Warsaw Pact and the USSR in particular were primarily in relation to those groups who shared their particular form of far-left ideology?
Yes.
CPGB. And that, would it be right to say that, for example, the Trotskyist groups were getting no support from the USSR?
I don't know.
Do you know whether or not Maoist groups were getting assistance from China in the late 1970s?
I don't know.
It may be testing your memory too much, say so if it is, but Mao died in 1976 and the Chinese form of communism moved on. Were you informed about that or instructed or told what difference that might make?
No.
Can I move now to anti-racist groups? One of the officers who was deployed whilst you were managing the SDS was the officer we know as HN 106.
Yes.
And he ended up spending quite a lot of his time with the East London Workers Against Racism group, didn't he?
Yes.
Could we just have a look at... well, before I do that, perhaps I should ask you, were you involved in HN 106's tasking or not?
I must have been, due to the time that he served, but I don't actually recall tasking him with that group.
But you were certainly aware that he was doing that, weren't you?
Yes.
Can you help us with why he was doing that?
I can't recall whether that group was his target or whether geographically he was in that area and became involved with them. I can't recall.
But either way, you were content for him to report on that group.
Yes.
And why was that?
I can't remember. I can only think that they offered a public order threat.
Right, well, let's have a look at some of the documents. Could we go, first of all, to the document which is at UCPI 5015540, So this is at tab 26 of your bundle. I'm afraid this isn't very easy to read. If it could be blown up a little bit, please. We're going to start at paragraph 2. This is a report dated the 18th of August 1981, which we understand came from HN 106. Paragraph 2 reads, on Monday the 10th of August 1981, between 7:30 and 10 p.m. at Rosswild Hall, Church Hill, London E17, a public meeting was held by the Winston Rose Action Campaign to discuss the death of Winston Rose in police custody and the action required to force the authorities to hold a public inquiry into the circumstances. Approximately 100 persons attended, slightly more than half of whom were black. If we could go down now to paragraph 4, please. I'm going to read from the middle of the page. Gitsmore, an extremely articulate speaker, concentrated much of his speech on a Marxist view of social and capital relations in Britain, concluding that the only way for racism to be eliminated was to overthrow capitalism itself. He intimated throughout his speech that he considered it the responsibility of the black section of the population to carry out the attack on capitalism, not mentioning the role that white workers should play in this activity at any time. If we could go over the page to paragraph 8. It says, Fran Eden of East London Workers Against Racism, when she spoke, launched into a tirade against the police and their racist attitudes and the racist scum in the Labour Party. Elwar, she stated, did not call for the reform of the police, but for their destruction. This speech was very well received by the audience. Eden also expressed the support of Elwar for rioters who had attacked the police during recent disturbances. If we could go down to the next paragraph. The mood of the meeting could be described as angry. Black separatists present who advocated revenge attacks upon the police, whilst not gaining outright support, did provoke an amount of quiet sympathy from some of the audience. Could we go now to page 5 of this file? That is the front page of the flyer that was attached to this report, illustrating that it was a meeting about calling for a public inquiry. I'm going to ask you 2 broad lines of questions about this. First of all, from your point of view, was there any policing value in reporting on a meeting such as this?
I think there were elements in that report of the speeches made which were of great interest to police. The call for the destruction of the police force sounds to me a call for violence and public disorder, which is the reason the SDS was established.
Second matter is this. This document is dated not very long after the Brixton riots, isn't it?
Yes.
The atmosphere was febrile, to say the least, wasn't it?
Yes.
There was a great deal of anger, wasn't there, amongst the black community?
Yes.
Do you think that in that atmosphere, having an undercover police officer report upon a meeting such as this risked doing more harm than good?
I think that really depends on what happened to the report when it was received, how it was disseminated, and whether any action ensued. The report in itself, I can't think, was anything but helpful.
Wasn't the risk that if an undercover officer was discovered doing this, that would be just the type of catalyst that might put people back on the streets?
I think that could probably be said of every report that an undercover officer submitted.
Do you think that this sort of reporting in these circumstances would secure, as Sir Robert Peel wanted, public approval?
Yes.
Why?
The group of people at the meeting, quite rightly, as you said, were annoyed and contributed to this febrile atmosphere. But there'd be many members of the public who would be very concerned that such a meeting was going on and such sentiments were being expressed. So I think it was wholly justified and a fine report.
We've seen a certain amount of evidence to the effect that the SDS was trying to monitor how far-left groups were interacting with the black community. Is that fair?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Is that what HN 106 was doing, infiltrating the East London Workers Against Racism to see how they were interacting with the black community?
That may have been a spin-off. I'm sure he was there to establish the risk they posed in terms of violence and demonstrations.
They being?
The members of the group he infiltrated.
Thank you. Could we take that document down, please? Could we have up now UCPI 5016611? Now, this is from 16th of April 1981, so this is in the immediate aftermath of the Brixton riots. We again think that this came from HM 106. This one is signed at the bottom by you. It says, the following information has been received from a reliable source. As a result of the violent disturbances in Brixton over the weekend of the 11th, 12th of April 1981, the RCT has brought forward plans to form a South London Workers Against Racism branch. At present, the level of activity is apparently restricted to attempting to arrange defence facilities for those arrested and to encourage defendants to employ the RCT's legal representatives. RCT influence amongst the Brixton black population is acknowledged to be minimal, and it is thought that an attempt to increase influence will be made through contact with local community leaders. The events in South London are unlikely to affect the commitment of East London Workers Against Racism in East London, and in particular Brick Lane, although support for particular occasions is always available. Now, the aspect of this report I want to ask you about, Mr. Butler, is the reporting about legal assistance and encouragement to use particular legal representatives. Did you have any concerns about reporting that sort of information?
No.
Did you have any instructions about reporting that sort of information?
I didn't, no.
And that sort of information in particular isn't relevant to public order, is it, specifically?
It isn't specifically, but it does indicate at present the level of activity is apparently restricted. It gives an insight to the fact that the RCT were not calling for direct street action. They were more concerned with the subject of that paragraph.
If we could take that down now and have up UCPI 5015302, the third and final document I want to take you to from the aftermath of the Brixton riots. This is a report dated the 30th of April. Again, it's our understanding that it comes from HN 106, and you sign it. We can go to the signature if you want to see it. It's at page 3 at the bottom. If we go back to the top, please, to page 1. At paragraph 2, we see it reads, on Friday the 24th of April 1981, between 7:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. at Stoke Newington Town Hall, Stoke Newington Church Street, N16, the East London Workers Against Racism held a public election meeting, with the events at Brixton 2 weeks before still a major talking point. The opportunity was taken to use the meeting to illustrate the similarities between events in Northern Ireland and those at Brixton. Approximately 50 people attended, and then the rest of the report is about the meeting. Was there any concern on your part about having an undercover police officer reporting upon the electoral activity of an anti-racist group weeks after the Brixton riots?
I think the undercover officers who infiltrated groups thought it was their responsibility to report as fully as they could on those groups. Some of the activity might suggest forthcoming demonstrations. Others might be just general background. And the officers, of course, having submitted this report, left it for others to analyse and disseminate as they felt fit.
Well, we may come to that later. I mean, you've made very clear in your witness statement your officers weren't inhibited in any way as to what to report, were they?
Correct.
Were you given any guidance as to whether there may be sensitive areas that ought to be avoided?
No.
At the time, you plainly didn't think this needed avoiding. Is that fair?
Yes.
What's your view now?
Now, today.
Please.
I think I hold the same view that if a group has been assessed as being of interest, then as much as possible should be reported on that group. Some of it might appear to be irrelevant, but the officer is not able to make that judgment at the time. And my attitude was always, it's far better to report too much than too little.
Can we take that down? Having said this was the last document, it's the last document from 106. There is another document from HN 356 that I'd like to show you, please.
Yes.
Could we have a UCPI 5015441, please? That could be just blown up a little bit. We think this is a report from HN 356. It's dated the 30th of June 1981. HN 356, it is our understanding, was deployed in South East London initially and for much of his time. But we see in this report, paragraph 2, on Thursday the 25th of June 1981 at 8:15 p.m. at the Tate Library, Effra Road, SW2, the new Brixton branch of the Socialist Workers' Party held its inaugural meeting. 9 persons were present. Then at 3, the meeting was chaired by Privacy, who commenced the proceedings by calling for the election of branch officers. After much argument, the undermentioned were elected to the following posts. And of relevance to us is branch treasurer William Biggs, and that was HN 356's cover name. So it appears that in the wake of the Brixton riots, the SWP are setting up a new branch in Brixton, and HN 356 is moving from South East London to South West London to follow that development. Is that right?
I don't recall. It appears so from the document in front of me.
And would it have been because there was interest in monitoring what the SWP were doing in a flashpoint?
I can't remember, presumably.
So would that be a convenient moment to take the break?
Certainly. We'll have a quarter of an hour break now, and I hope we'll be able to resume your evidence then.
All rise, please.
Mr. Butler,
Sir.
you have explained in your witness statement that you got the occasional request from senior managers for specific information about events, but otherwise you say the SDS was left to get on with things, and you also say that you were left very much alone. Did that apply not just generally, but also to the question of where you targeted your officers?
I can't recall exactly how they were targeted. I think it was guidance from senior officers, and as I say, it was generally to ensure as complete coverage geographically as possible.
Did you consider it any part of your duty to consider whether there were alternative ways of obtaining the same intelligence or weighing the degree of intrusion into the lives of the activists with the benefit to be gained for policing purposes?
I never gave that any consideration, no.
Did you review any of the deployments, formally or otherwise?
I don't recall. I think they seem to satisfy the criteria that was required.
Can I ask you now to answer the next question with a yes or a no? Did you terminate any deployments on the grounds that you didn't think they were worthwhile?
No.
Again, yes, no. Did you alter the course of the deployment of any of your officers because you thought what they were doing was not worthwhile?
No.
Coming back to those specific requests from intelligence from senior managers, was your intelligence going from the SDS to S Squad or from the SDS to C Squad?
To S Squad.
Now, are you sure about that? Because we've had conflicting evidence on that issue.
My understanding that it all went to S Squad and it was for them to decide its onward path.
And were the specific requests coming from S Squad or from other squads or both?
I think from S Squad.
You say you think. How sure are you?
Fairly sure. I can't recall any other way of receiving requests.
Was there any change in the nature of the requests you were getting after the 1979 general election?
I can't recall that.
Was there any change in the nature of the requests that you were getting after the 1981 election as leader of the GLC of Ken Livingstone?
Again, I can't recall any change.
I'd like to move now to a completely different topic, and that is your relationship with the security service. And it's right to say, isn't it, that you met them on a number of occasions whilst working for the SDS?
I've looked at some reports from the security service, and I accept that I did, but I'm afraid my memory is failing me on those meetings.
Right, we'll look at a few documents. The first one I want to show you, in fact, predates your time in the SDS. Could we have UCPI 30049, please? And this is a 1973 document. It's from 13th of November 1973. At paragraph 2, it says the security service defined their primary targets for agent operations as the Socialist Labour League, which of course became the Workers' Revolutionary Party, International Socialists, which as I'm sure you know became the Socialist Workers' Party, and the IMG. The ideal would be a permanent, well-placed employee in each headquarters, not necessarily too high up in the organisation. Secondary targets were, we've had to redact those, but the security service requirements in these two cases was virtually only for membership details. Was it your understanding in the late 1970s that the security service was still very keen for the SDS to have someone at headquarters level in the Socialist Workers' Party?
I don't recall that group, no.
Okay, if we could take that down, please. Can we look at some of the documents in your era? First of all, the document which is at tab 3 of your bundle, UCPI 5028810. Now, this is about a meeting which occurred on the 2nd of October 1979. Starts by saying the head of the SDS paid a routine visit to CSH, which we understand to be the Security Services premises, on the 2nd of October 1979. This was an opportunity to say farewell to DI Angus McIntosh and to meet his successor, Trevor Butler. After lunch at the Waterloo Dispatch in Adams Row, we returned to CSH for discussions. So it appears that you were introduced to the SDS almost straight away, doesn't it?
It does appear so.
A feature of the documents we're going to look at is there was very often an opportunity for a bite to eat and a drink, either before or after the meeting with the security service. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
Can you recall what sort of things you discussed with them in the margins of your meetings?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
This document goes on to include a specific request at 2A about training. And then if we go over to page 2, please. There's some discussion of photographs and then future coverage. And at little e, picking up from near the bottom, I said that if possible, we would be interested in reports on one or two specific resolutions, such as those dealing with Flame, Women's Voice, and the organisation of the party. This is in connection with the forthcoming SWP National Conference. I asked if reports provided on the new Communist Party and the Workers' Party indicated that the squad had sources close to the group. Ferguson confirmed that these reports were unlikely to continue. Now, coming back to those specific requests about Flame, Women's Voice, and the organisation of the SWP, was it typical of the security service to make specific requests like this?
I'm afraid I can't recall.
And if we go to G, this is about the officer we know as HN354. I can tell you his real name, it's Vince Harvey. It was confirmed that Vince Harvey is being withdrawn. A replacement will eventually be provided, albeit in a different geographical area. Was it the norm to keep the security service informed about when officers started and ended their deployments?
I don't think so.
What's the basis for saying that?
Ugh, I just can't recall it.
I see. In paragraph 3, it says, in general conversation, we touched on the problems of agents being involved in actions of varying degrees of illegality. Ferguson remarked that certainly for the more trivial offences, this was no real hindrance to their operations, since they were often able to insulate their sources, even though this sometimes meant not prosecuting other offenders. Can you recall whether you had any discussions with Ferguson about this sort of matter?
I don't recall.
Yes, no, please. Can you recall any instance in which a prosecution was dropped in order to protect an undercover police officer?
No.
Over the page, paragraph 4, Head SDS re-emphasised the value of these regular meetings, and we agreed to get together again in the second week of November. Can you give us an impression about how grateful the security service was for the relationship you had with them?
No, I can't.
Can we take that down and go now, please, to tab 5, UCPI 29198. Now, this is a document which records that somebody from the security service called on DCI Ferguson on the 6th of November 1979 and gave him briefs prepared by Security Services F7 branch in relation to a number of things, including the SWP National Conference and the debrief of the SDS source in Walthamstow. We know that that source was Vince Harvey. So if we go over the page now and have a look at those, this loose minute contained very detailed questions about the SWP. So, for example, if you look at 1A under general points, it says, delegates. It is understood that local branches will send one delegate per 30 members. We are learning the names of a number of these, but a full list, if available, would be welcome. And if we go down to 2A, says we would be particularly glad of early comments on the following topics: industrial situation and policies. What is the SWP's assessment of their intervention in recent strikes? And then we've had to summarise the next passage as a broad range of forthcoming strikes. And the questions go on. If we go over the page, at F1, we see questions about the Anti-Nazi League, about the Women's Voice, and about Flame. Is it your recollection that the security service were interested in really pretty granular details?
I've no recollection.
Do you have any recollection of meeting with them, discussing matters at this sort of level of detail and trying to service their requests?
I do not.
Can you recall whether or not the SDS provided intelligence to the security service trying to fulfill their requests?
If that was the case, I assume it would have been done through S-Squad office.
Well, we've got a lot of meeting notes, and if you don't remember, there may not be much point in me putting them all to you, but there are quite a lot of them at which you are recorded as having been present. Are you telling me that you simply can't remember any of these now?
That is the fact.
I see. Can I now move to the question of subversion? You've told us already that you can't recall any tuition on this subject. Can I just put a couple of documents to you in case they jog your memory. Can we have up UCPI 604459? Now this is a covering letter to a circular dated 1970 to all chief constables, which covers the terms of reference for Special Branch's relationship with the security service. And if we go over the page, you'll see it deals with the responsibility of Special Branch and the function of Special Branch vis-à-vis the security service. And if we look on page 2, at paragraph 3D, you see it says, in consultation with the security service to collect, process and record information about subversive or potentially subversive organisations and individuals. Do you recall seeing these terms of reference?
I don't know.
Do you recall being familiar with the task of collecting, processing and recording information about subversive or potentially subversive organisations for the security service?
No.
If we go to page 4, paragraph 3, there is a definition of subversion. It says, it is important that special branches should have a clear idea of what constitutes persons and organisations which may be judged to be subversive of the security of the state. Broadly speaking, these are any organisation or individual whose purpose is the undermining or overthrow of the established democratic order. Can you now recall being presented with this definition?
No, I can't recall.
Does it accord with your understanding of what a subversive group was?
Yes, I think so.
Can you recall that definition ever changing?
No.
Could we have up, please, if we take that down, could we have up UCPI 604545? Now, this is another circular from the Security Service to Chief Constables about subversive activities in industrial disputes. It essentially makes the point that there is a distinction between militant industrial action and action designed to use industry to overthrow the state. Can you recall being made aware of that distinction?
No.
Do you think that you may have been and simply can't remember it, or are you saying that it didn't happen?
I can't remember it. It may not have happened.
If we go to the bottom of page 2, paragraph 4, please. This has a slightly different definition of subversion. It says subversion is defined as activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial or violent means. Slightly different to the last definition I read out to you. Can you recall being instructed about this definition?
No.
Is it something that might have happened?
It might have happened.
Could we take that down, please? Could we have up UCPI 5034698? Now, this is a document entitled Subversive Activities in Schools, dated the 16th of December 1975. And if we go over the page to paragraph 2, again, it's a circular to Chief Constables. Paragraph 2 says, we do not ask you to make inquiries in schools on our behalf, but we would welcome any help you could give us on the basis of information which comes your way from the local papers or from members of the public or by recourse to other sources outside schools which you can use without risk of embarrassment. Can you recall being given any guidance at all about subversion in schools?
I wasn't, no.
Can you recall feeling any sensitivity about that issue?
I don't think the position arose.
We know that some SDS officers, notably HN 126, did make reports which referred to children, particularly in the context of the group School Kids Against the Nazis. Can you recall that group?
I don't recall the group, no.
Can you recall whether there was any concern that extremist groups on both left and right were seeking to influence school children?
I don't recall there was any particular concern, no.
Can we take that down, please? In your witness statement, you deal at one point with what you thought the most important things that the SDS did were. Top of your list was public order. And you then went on to say the second most important contribution was the provision of information to update MPSB files. Can you help us with what SDS intelligence on MPSB files was used for?
The files, MPSB files, were just a collection of reports. Each one would have been dealt with individually, and the file would be maintained either about a group or association or an individual. Any new report coming into the branch would be placed on the appropriate file, sometimes a general file, sometimes a personal file.
That doesn't quite answer my question. What I'm driving at is if you think that this was the second most important thing that the SDS did, what I'm trying to find out is why it was so important. What was it that this information could be used for that made it an important contribution?
Well, the importance might have been immediate if the report referred to an individual or a group which was under active review. It would have been immediate importance. If not, it could have relevance and importance in the future.
And is that an importance perhaps for informing reports about public order?
Presumably.
Do you know?
I don't know. I can't recall all the different reports that were submitted and filed.
I'm asking in general terms. Do you think SDS reporting, for example, contributed to the ability to vet people?
Quite possibly.
Do you think that SDS reporting contributed to special branches' understanding of activist groups?
Yes.
You use the phrase latent value of information more than once in your witness statement. What did you mean by that?
Information which might appear to have no immediate interest, but which could possibly be relevant at a future date.
Now, at a point in your witness statement, when you're explaining why you thought it was important to have comprehensive intelligence coverage, you say, providing that those individuals were not unlawfully discriminated against because of this. What were you meaning by that?
I don't know, I'd have to look at the whole paragraph.
Yeah, sure, we can get that up. It's MPS-0747-658. Page 37. So if we, it's paragraph 129 I want. So if you want to see the context, if we go back one page, it reads, having considered the reports above, a close reading shows that each of them contains relevant and useful information. Even though parts may seem unacceptable, in today's context, the difficulty is that you either have state-controlled organisations that keep a record of potential extremists and activists, or you do not. When something untoward happens, there will be some who will most likely criticise the state if it does not react quickly enough and in a targeted fashion to investigate the perpetrators and bring them to justice. That is much more difficult to do from a standing start. I do not believe that individuals finding their names on a special branch or security service file is too high a price to pay for comprehensive intelligence coverage, providing that those individuals were not unlawfully discriminated against because of this.
Not quite sure what I meant by it.
Were you perhaps referring to the risk that information might improperly have been leaked to employers who would blacklist employees?
I can't really think of any other unlawful discrimination arising from retaining this intelligence, so I think that's probably what I was thinking about.
And why was that on your mind?
I think when I made this statement, I was probably justifying the reporting on and maintaining records about members of the public, which I thought was acceptable, as I said there, providing as a result they don't lose their job or are blacklisted, which then, unless there are exceptional circumstances, becomes unacceptable.
Was it a known risk at the time you were serving in Special Branch that information might get out and lead to people losing their jobs?
Not at all.
Can I take it then, so far as you are aware, nothing was done to stop it?
To stop what?
The unlawful disclosure of information leading to people losing their jobs?
Well, I'm convinced that Special Branch records were properly maintained and there was no leakage. I added that at the end of that paragraph as a caveat, that's all.
Thank you. Could we take that down, please? And could we look at the document at tab 23 of your bundle, sir? UCPI 5015469. This is a report dated the 10th of July 1981, said submitted here from a reliable source, and then we have redacted to protect people's privacy all the names. But if we just look down the right-hand column, you can see in relation to some of them is the annotation N/T. Is that for no trace?
It is.
And so we can take it that some of the names that have ended up on file are people from this address book who were unknown to Special Branch at the time.
It depends how the report was handled by S Squad, or if it was C Squad as the recipient. Quite often, no traces would not be recorded, and in fact UIs unidentified would also fail to be recorded.
Yes, I mean this one, we can go over the page, there are more NTs there, and then over to the last page, and we see your signature at the bottom and another NT. It appears on this occasion that the document was filed, we've got it from a security service file, it was filed with the no trace names all left included. Was that normal?
I'm not sure. I think it probably was. The fact that there were no trace at that stage didn't preclude them from becoming people of interest, so it may well have been retained on a general file, yes.
Thank you. Could we take that down? I want to ask you now about how well you got to know the undercover officers under your command. You've explained in your witness statement that you met them periodically on a one-to-one basis, often playing squash, as I understand it, and for a bite to eat. Is that right?
Yes.
And then you met them usually twice weekly in either the South or West Safe House.
Yes.
And you would have talked to them at that stage about their deployments and their well-being.
Yes.
Over time, how well did you get to know these officers?
Some of them very well, others not quite so well, but reasonably well, all of them.
Enough that they were telling you what they were doing in their deployments, and you knew a little bit about their well-being and their home lives. Would that be a fair generality?
It would be, yes.
Can I ask you a little bit about the environment? The unit was all male, wasn't it, at that time?
Yes.
And was it, would you describe it as a male environment?
Yes.
Banter?
Yes.
Jokes?
Yes.
Some of them of a sexual nature?
Can't remember, but probably.
Was there any joking to the effect that officers might have been the subject of sexual advances by female activists?
No.
Are you sure about that?
If it was said as a joke, it was certainly something that I've forgotten by now.
Was there any ever joking to the effect that an officer had some sexual contact with an activist?
Certainly not, no.
Was there any serious discussion about the problem of what to do if a female member of a group or a female member of the public became amorous with an undercover police officer?
That wasn't discussed, no.
Are you sure?
Not by me.
Did you consider whether there was a risk that there may be sexual activity?
No.
Did you consider that they may be tempted to participate in sexual activity?
I might have considered that that was a possibility, but I trusted all of them, who I knew quite well, not to be so involved.
I mean, they were pretending to be single men, weren't they?
Yes.
And they were infiltrating groups, many of which were sexually quite liberal.
Yes.
And they might have thought, mightn't they, that getting together with an activist might keep them safer and enhance their cover?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Because the selection process, as you alluded to much earlier, ensured that they were married men with a stable background who I trusted not to get involved sexually outside of their marriage.
If it was based on trust, can you help us? Did you ever give them a reminder?
No.
Did you ever suggest to them ways that they might reduce the risk of a sexual contact?
No.
Do you think, looking back, that it would have been a good idea to do that?
I'm sure it would.
Can I ask you now about some specific officers? First of all, some officers who served before your time, and I want to know whether you heard anything about them. Did you hear anything at all about Richard Clark?
No.
In a sexual connection? Did you hear anything at all in terms of a sexual, including a romantic connection, about the officer we know as HN 300?
No.
We have evidence that HN 300 formed a lasting relationship with an activist and in fact went on to marry her. Was there any talk in the office, any gossip about who HN 300 was marrying?
No.
Can I now ask you to look at a section of somebody else's witness statement? This is a witness statement of HN 106. And it's at MPS-0745-735. And if we could go to page 43, please, and start at paragraph 132. The only reason I can think of for the security service file note relates to another incident connected with a woman called Privacy. I knew Privacy as she was Privacy's wife or partner. I cannot remember if they were married or what her surname was. She was not an activist herself. During my deployment, Privacy and Privacy split up. A few months after this, I bumped into Privacy while I was selling papers on Brick Lane. She invited me to come around for a drink, and I met up with her. Neither of us were interested in a romantic relationship. I was happily married with 2 small children, and Privacy was very much still in love with Privacy, who had left her for another woman. In fact, I think the reason she wanted to spend time with me was to hear what Privacy had been up to. I went for a drink with Privacy on a couple of occasions and also went around to her house. If I had had something to drink and could not drive home, I would sometimes stay over at Privacy's home. I would sleep in one of her children's rooms and they would share with her. I remember there was a hamster in the child's room which would keep me awake at night, running around in its wheel. I do not think that I stayed over more than 5 or so times. And if we could scroll down, please. I became quite close with Privacy, and even though it was an entirely platonic relationship, some activists started to refer to Privacy as Barry's girlfriend. Barry Tompkins was this officer's cover name. I do not think that they said this in front of Privacy. I did not correct them, as it was actually helpful for my cover for people to think I had a girlfriend, as I otherwise faced questions about why a young man seemingly had no interest in women. And if we could go over the page, please. One day, Trevor Butler asked to speak with me. He told me that a telephone call had been intercepted, during which there had been discussion of where items from Ireland could safely be stored. It was discussed that the only place deemed not to be under surveillance was Barry's girlfriend's place. I think Trevor said something along the lines of, "You're not going to get us into trouble, are you?" And I simply said, "No, it's nothing like that." I did not feel the need to say much more, as there was not anything untoward to explain. Trevor never actually mentioned Privacy's name, but I have always assumed that this must have referred to Privacy. My relationship with Privacy was never anything more than friends, but I was very sad when I had to disappear from her life. First question. Can you recall HN 106 ever speaking of the woman concerned?
No.
Can you recall speaking with HN 106 as described by him in his witness statement?
No.
Do you accept that his recollection is likely to be correct?
No.
Why not?
It didn't happen.
Why are you so sure that it didn't happen, as opposed to being just something that you cannot now remember 40 years later?
I can't answer that question. I just know that didn't happen.
Why are you being so categoric? He wasn't explaining, he wasn't confessing any wrongdoing on his account.
I just cannot recall any knowledge that I had of an intercepted phone call, and I wasn't aware that he had this girlfriend. So I'm fairly satisfied that he's either confused me with another officer from the office, or I don't know the answer.
If HN 106 had explained to you what he sets out in his witness statement, what would you have done?
I don't know. It's my outlook was probably different then than it is now. I think we'd have had to have a fairly long discussion about whether or not the position was sustainable.
Could you help us with what your outlook was then?
No, can't remember.
Well, you just said that your outlook was different. I
said it may have been different. I can't recall. Now, I think I would have insisted that he ended such a relationship. Then I might have been more tolerant.
And why would you have been more tolerant back in the day?
Oh, purely because I've become older and more disagreeable.
Were attitudes different in those days?
I'm sure mine was, yes.
How big a deal in those days would you have regarded an undercover police officer forming a platonic friendship with a woman?
I wouldn't have been concerned, providing it didn't look as if it could become a problem for the officer or the SDS.
Is one of the things that leaps from the page of this statement that there might in fact have been more going on?
Certainly.
And back in the day, would you have investigated to establish whether or not you were being told the whole story?
It's a hypothetical question. It didn't happen. I would have investigated very thoroughly.
Would you have put out a warning to other officers to be careful about the friendships that they were forming?
In the event that this had happened, yes, I probably would.
In the event that you had discovered an officer having a sexual relationship with a woman, do you think it would have led to disciplinary proceedings or not?
I don't think that would be a question for me. I think I would have ensured the officer's removal from the SDS, but as to any disciplinary action thereafter, I don't know.
Are you telling me it's above your pay grade?
Indeed.
Might there have been difficulties with formally disciplining a police officer who had been undercover because of the rights that that officer would have under the police disciplinary procedures?
I'm sure it would have been a very difficult decision to take, yes.
Can we take that document down, please, and can we have up UCPI 5027446? Now, this is another note made by the security service. It comes from their liaison file with the SDS. It's dated just after your time. It relates to a visit to the SDS on the 29th of June 1982. I'm showing you it because of what it says at paragraph 5. It says, I stressed to David Short our continued interest in blank and asked that HN 106 should pass on anything that suggested a continuing contact between, we've had to redact it, information on this subject may be bedeviled by the fact that HN 106 has probably bedded blank and been warned off by his bosses. Can you help us with whether you know anything at all about the circumstances in which HN 106 appears to have been warned off by bosses who thought he had probably bedded a person?
No.
might you have been concerned and pass this on to Mr. Short? Is there any possibility that that happened?
No.
Can we take that down, please? Can we have your witness statement back up again? That's MPS-0747658. Can we have page 26, please? Paragraph 98. Now this reads, from the passage provided to me, it seems as though he was quite close to the lady. And this is referring to 106. I know that he was married with young children at the time, and I believe I would have reminded him about his obligations to them and to the job in fairly strong terms if I had even the slightest suspicion that he had or was tempted to stray. I would certainly have checked with him that his wife knew where he was on the evenings when he stayed over. It is possible that HN106 has mixed me up with one of the other managers. Now, what I want to ask you about this passage is that you are clearly thinking about HN106's marriage and his wife and children. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And you are plainly thinking about the risk which such conduct might present to the SDS and the Metropolitan Police.
Yes.
Is that right? But what you don't mention is the woman with whom HN106 had formed this, on his account, entirely platonic but plainly quite close friendship. Was that deliberate?
As I was unaware that this officer had formed this platonic or otherwise relationship, it's a hypothetical question, and so no, I gave the other party no consideration at all.
If this had happened, would you have given the other party any consideration?
I don't know. Possibly I might have tried to establish a reasonable way for the officer to disentangle himself. I don't know. I can't really comment.
What was the attitude in the day? Was it that the activists were just wearies?
And what are they?
So you don't recognise the term, just activists. Was that the attitude that they were the other side?
To a certain extent, they were individuals, and some were potentially more of a threat than others. But yes, they were basically the people we were trying to gain information about.
Did you give any consideration that the harm that might be done to a woman who was deceived sexually by an undercover police officer?
No.
Can we take that down now, please? Can I ask you now about Vince Harvey? Can you recall whether you ever met Vince Harvey as he was about to leave the SDS?
I don't think so.
Can you ever recall whether you met him for one of your one-to-ones over a game of squash and a bite to eat?
I don't recall working with Vince Harvey. I'm not sure whether our times did overlap.
As far as we can tell, he's coming out of the field about the time you're starting. What I'm interested in is I'm going to show you a postcard. It's UCPI 5034819. Now, this is a postcard which Vince Harvey sent to his group after he had withdrawn as part of covering his exfiltration. Can you recall this tactic being used?
No, I can't.
Do you know who decided to use this tactic?
I've no idea.
Thank you. If we could take that down, please. The officer we know as HN21 how well did you know HN21?
Reasonably well.
HN21 has told us that he did have sex with a woman twice in his undercover identity, and that it happened after a friendship had developed between them over a period of time. Did HN21, in any of his conversations with you, give you the impression he was getting close to anybody?
No, he didn't.
How surprised are you by HN21's evidence that he did have sex with a woman twice when he was undercover?
I'm surprised.
Do you think, with hindsight, that you might have been able to put him off doing so if you had asked more questions or put across the line more strongly that this sort of thing was off limits?
Possibly.
HN126, please. Did he tell you at any stage that he was getting on very well with a member of the opposite sex?
No.
Or express any concerns that he might be coming close to somebody?
No.
So would now be a good time to break for lunch?
Certainly. We'll resume at 2.